Orders of the day.
Order of the day number 3, Family Violence Amendment, Protecting People and Their Pets Bill 2024, Bill number 38, second reading.
Honourable Member for Elwick.
Mr President, I move that the bill now be read the second time.
I speak to it.
Oh.
That's it. Yeah.
Mr President, I give forewarning that I'm about to talk about family violence. I acknowledge this is a sensitive and difficult topic to discuss, and that some of the content of this debate may be triggering for some people here in the chamber or watching online today. I acknowledge and extend my support to all those who have experienced and survived family violence and those who are affected by family violence today. I acknowledge those who have devastatingly lost their lives through family violence. I acknowledge those who have lost someone they love or care about as the result of family violence. And relevant to this bill today, I also recognise that animals can be harmed by family violence too. If anyone feels emotionally triggered by today's debate, support is available by calling Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the Safe at Home Family Violence Response and Referral line on 1800 633 937. Mr President, family violence is one of the most serious and confronting issues in our society. Today, as noted by the member for Rosevears, I and other honourable members are wearing an orange ribbon to symbolise our support for the United Nations 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, held annually from November 25 to December 10. The statistics for the prevalence of family violence in Tasmania are horrifying. Over 32% of women in Tasmania have experienced violence, emotional abuse or economic abuse by a cohabiting partner. I also note that men can be victims of family violence too. Family violence can take on many forms and involve a range of conduct. These types of violence can have a serious impact on individuals, families and communities. It can inflict physical injury, psychological trauma and emotional suffering. The effects can be long-lasting and can affect future generations. It is imperative that Tasmania's legislation recognises all forms of family violence so that Tasmania's justice system, police officers and first responders are empowered to recognise, respond to, intervene and prevent family violence at every possible opportunity. Causing injury to an animal, including a pet, can be an incredibly distressing and cruel form of family violence. Australian and international research on animal abuse in the context of family violence found the prevalence of animal abuse in these contexts is high, ranging from between 12% to 89%. The Australian Law Reform Commission, or ARLC's landmark 2010 report titled Family Violence, a National Legal Response, made a recommendation that injury to animals be included as a form of family violence in each state and territory's relevant domestic or family violence legislation. 14 years on, Tasmania is the only jurisdiction where harm to animals is still not explicitly recognised as a form of family violence. Mr President, this bill seeks to change this by fully adopting the recommendation of the ALRC report to not only ensure Tasmania is brought in line with the rest of the country, but leads the way in terms of legislative reform that recognises harm or the threat of harm to animals as a form of family violence. The bill provides that conduct committed by a person resulting in harm, injury or neglect to an animal, or making threats thereof, is a form of family violence if it coerces, intimidates or controls a person's spouse or partner, or causes mental harm to, apprehension or fear in a person's spouse or partner. The bill achieves this through an amendment to Section 7 of the Family Violence Act 2004, which sets out the definition of family violence that is used throughout this Act and which is also used in other Tasmanian legislation. By explicitly recognising this common form of family violence in legislation, it is the intent of the bill to empower police officers, support services and Tasmania's justice system to appropriately and rapidly recognise and respond to such conduct as a family violence matter. For example, this bill may provide clearer grounds for police officers to issue a police family violence order, or PFVO, in instances where this type of family violence has occurred. This bill adopts the same fundamental approach used in several other jurisdictions, with some minor differences in this bill to strengthen the language and ensure the scope of the definition is suitably broad. One of the variations between this bill and what exists in other jurisdictions is that this bill includes the element of neglect of an animal, in addition to harm or injury of an animal. The intent of this is to include circumstances where, for example, a family violence perpetrator deliberately neglects an animal to inflict suffering or harm on their spouse or partner, such as by refusing the animal food, urgent veterinary care, or critical medication. A second variation between this bill and other jurisdictions is that this bill includes the objective test of knows or reasonably ought to know within paragraph F. The intention of this is to enhance the provability of this type of family violence, which is beneficial to victim survivors. Mr. President, both of these elements were introduced to the bill via amendments as a result of further feedback and advice from experts, including the Department of Justice and Safe at Home members. These amendments were unanimously supported in the other place and are supported by key stakeholders, including Gender Equality Tasmania. I acknowledge that the Act as it currently stands includes damage to property as a form of family violence, with the definition of property under Section 4 encompassing everything animate or inanimate that is capable of being owned. Arguably, this means that harm to an animal, articulated as damage to property under the Act, is already captured as a form of family violence in Tasmania's legislation. However, firstly, this does not recognise that threats of harm against a pet or another animal are often made by perpetrators of family violence to coerce, intimidate or control a spouse or partner, regardless of whether such harm eventuates or not. And secondly, it is not appropriate for harm or the threat of harm to a dearly loved pet to be considered or referred to as damage to property in legislation. Pets and support animals are so much more than property to many people, often providing critical emotional support for people who are experiencing immense trauma and fear at the hands of a perpetrator of family violence. I also acknowledge that harm against animals may also already fall within the broad scope of the offence under Section 9 of the Act, which is the offence of emotional abuse or intimidation. It is the intent of this bill to remove uncertainty in applying this offence to family violence conduct involving animal harm or threats thereof. Mr. President, I want to acknowledge national not-for-profit organisation Lucy's Project, who have been a fierce advocate for better supports for people and animals experiencing family violence. Their tireless work in highlighting this issue and advocating for this particular form in Tasmania should be recognised. I also want to thank Gender Equality and in particular their CEO, Bec Thomas, for their support of this bill and for the continual work they do to raise awareness about family violence in Tasmania and support those affected by it. RSPCA Tasmania, Community Legal Centres Tasmania, the Huon Domestic Violence Service, Sexual Assault Support Service and others have also written to honourable members indicating their support for this bill, and I thank them too for their advocacy. Governments right across the country must do more to address family violence, Mr. President. I firmly believe whole-of-government reforms are needed in Tasmania to better prevent family violence and support those affected by it. Although the change this bill introduces is small compared to the level of change that is needed in Tasmania and across the country, it is nonetheless an important change to make. I acknowledge the independent member for Franklin in the other place, David O'Byrne MP, who introduced this bill and carried it through with unanimous support. And I thank Mr O'Byrne and his team for entrusting me with the carriage of this important bill through this place. I appreciate the member for Mersey's support in this too. In closing, I want to once again recognise and acknowledge family violence victim survivors, advocates and all those who support Tasmanians who are affected by the impacts of family violence. Mr President, I commend the bill to the House.
Question is the bill be now